What would you do if someone you loved was trapped in an unhappy, dysfunctional relationship? And what if, despite all the red flags, they just couldn't bring themselves to walk away? Would you label it codependency, trauma bond, or would you even know the difference? I've spent a few decades coaching women on every aspect of their relationships, and it turns out that the distinction between codependency and trauma bonding is a lot trickier and a lot more important than you might think. And I had this really wrong for a long time for a glaringly obvious reason that I want to share with you so you can avoid making the same mistake. Because this won't just transform how you view your own relationship, it could be the key to protecting those you love. In 1992, my mom gave me a copy of Melody Beattie's book, Codependent No More, for Christmas. I read it in one night and immediately saw myself in the caretaker role that Beattie described, constantly prioritizing others' needs over my own and not really having a solid sense of who I was. I also was enamored with the book's idea of detachment. If I could be less attached and stop caretaking, then I thought maybe I'd not be so worried and feeling so overwhelmed. It felt like I finally found an answer for my personal struggles. I carried that codependent label into work, into dating, and finally into marriage. When my husband would come home late and refuse to explain where he'd been, I chalked my worry and anxiety up to just being codependent. And when he would make fun of me for cooking a casserole for dinner, saying, "Who do you think you are, Betty Crocker?" I blamed my loneliness and hurt feelings on being codependent. And when I started coping with my creeping sense of despair by shopping and drinking and seeking attention outside my marriage, I figured once again, this must be because of my codependency. I basically thought that anytime I wanted connection, care, attention, or even companionship, this was due to being fundamentally broken, thinking that my codependency, my internal flaw, was the cause of my suffering. Before I explain the glaring problem, let's talk about codependency. Codependency isn't a clinical term or an official diagnosis. The term was originally used to describe the partner of an alcoholic or an addict. In this partnership, one was dependent on the substance and the other, the codependent, enabled that dependency. The definition that I use for codependency is the condition of not having a clear sense of self, and instead making someone else the center of your thoughts, emotion, and behavior. It means the axis of who you are isn't really running through the middle of you, it's running through the middle of someone else, and you're orbiting around them. So let's get a little scientific for a moment. Codependency and trauma bonding have biological things in common. They both cause feel-good chemicals like dopamine, a reward system that keeps you coming back for more. They cause your body to pump out the stress hormone cortisol, and over time that affects your health. So both trauma bonds and codependent relationships have what's called a negative reinforcement loop. In simple terms, you find some relief or you even feel better about yourself when you're the one responsible or you're the one that's caretaking. It's a cycle that's tough to break, and what this all boils down to is that our bodies are kind of set up in a way that can lock us into these unhealthy relationships, whether they're trauma bonds or codependent situations. So does that mean that codependency is the same as a trauma bond? There are a lot of overlapping factors here: the lack of solid sense of self, low self-esteem, chronic stress, lack of boundaries, and similar biological processes. But there's something really important that I failed to recognize, and it actually goes all the way back to that Christmas in 1992. My mother, a physically and emotionally abusive narcissist, gave me that book. She basically handed me a book that told me that if I was unhappy, I was the problem. And I believed that because I desperately wanted to believe that I could change things. And this leads me to the key difference between codependency and a trauma bond, and it's that one word, abuse. And this is why it's so important to understand, because often the victim of a trauma bond doesn't even know they're being abused, especially within a narcissistically abusive relationship. In this type of situation, a lot of people don't recognize that something's wrong or that narcissistic abuse is even a thing that's happening. They don't know that narcissism doesn't change. They don't know that it's not their fault, and most assume that they are probably the one that's the problem. I was one of those people, and blaming my pain on codependency actually kept me stuck in an abusive relationship for years. Now, this doesn't mean that I don't tend towards codependency codependency. I definitely do. But the most specific difference is that codependency doesn't necessarily involve abuse. In trauma bonding, the relationship is actually held together by the cycle of abuse. And this is important because when you're in a relationship, especially where there's narcissistic abuse, and you're like most people, you will recognize it. And over time, you become more and more bonded through that cycle of abuse. Emotional harm followed by an apology, an affection, or kindness. And this intermittent reinforcement creates a strong emotional bond that's very hard to break. When you're in this cycle, you may even defend or cover up for the abuser, all while not even realizing what you're doing. So what's the takeaway? While there are many different factors, the key difference here lies in the presence of abuse. The problem is that in these situations, the abuse is often unrecognized by the victim. It's not always a clear-cut distinction. In reality, you might be dealing with elements of both. My advice, rather than trying to label it one way or another, I'd say to consider both possibilities. Notice if you have resistance to calling this one thing or another. The resistance might be a sign of an uncomfortable truth that you're unconsciously avoiding. And the most vital advice I can offer you is to educate yourself about what narcissistic abuse looks like, especially covert narcissists, because they're so difficult to spot. To learn more about that, watch this next.